Shalom and welcome to another special edition of Crossing Over here on Now You See TV. Crossing Over is a biblical journey beyond the chasm toward the path of life, and I am your host, Patricia Hall, and joining me tonight is our special guest, Nitsa Moshe. Hi, Nitsa. How are you this evening?
Shalom. Welcome. Good to be here.
I am really excited about continuing our special series on homeschool education. So I'm really excited to have you here this evening. Ezpeleta-Lucas could not make it with us tonight, but I'm just really excited that you're here with us. On today's show, like I mentioned, we will be continuing our homeschool education series by discussing some legal issues to consider. And I will say right off the bat that disclaimer, we are not dispensing any legal advice. We don't have the capacity to do so, but we are going to be presenting some issues that each person needs to do their own due diligence and research for themselves. But before we begin our show, I do have a few announcements. If you haven't already, please hit the subscribe button and the notification bell so that you won't miss any of our shows in the future. If you are watching on YouTube and you would like to come over to the Now You See TV Live Hub, that's the chat room I'm going to be moderating. If you have any questions or comments that you would like discussed on the show, just hit the link in the description below, and that will bring you to the nowuseetv.org. And give me just a moment to screen share, and I will show you what that looks like. Oh, it is not allowing me to do that. I apologize. So it will bring you to nowuseetv.org. When you get there, there will be a live show hub. You just scroll down and it just hit the live fellowship chat. And in there, you can have wonderful discussions with our fellowship family there. And if you have a question for either me or Nitsa, if you would please indicate that by typing your question in all caps, that would be helpful for me. And please, if you haven't already, go over to nowuseetv.org. It is just an amazing website. If you're looking for fellowship, there's a fellowship finder. You can get some really amazing Yeshua wear, t-shirts, things like that. You can get a lot of just fabulous information. Also, another announcement I'd like to make is the Take on the World conference is coming up in August 24th through the 26th in Vermilion, Ohio. And you can find out more information on takeontheworld2018.org. And also, the next announcement I have is if you are making plans for Sukkot, Now You See TV is organized a Sukkot gathering September 24th through October 2nd in Lincoln State Park, Indiana. And you can find out information about that on Sukkot2018.org. And there's also a Sukkot 2018 Facebook page. You can get connected with us on Crossing Over Facebook page, or you can email us at crossingover8@gmail.com. We also have a NYSTV Fellowship Group Facebook page. So those are just a variety of ways for you to get in contact with us to stay connected. All right, so last week, that's the conclusion of our announcements. Last week, we began our series on homeschool education with just a general introduction. We had a biblical discussion of our God-given mandate to train up our children according to Scripture. And this week, we will be discussing the importance of every homeschool educator to do their diligence and research the legalities, the laws, the regulations, the codes. And we're going to go into all that this evening in your own respective states and school districts. Again, we are not providing any legal advice on this show, but we will be bringing up topics for you to do your research on. So whether you're considering home education or you're already in the process of home education, it is your responsibility. It's our responsibility to do our research on the laws and regulations where we live so that we can understand what's required for our compliance. All right. So Nitsa, before we get started, do you have any words of introduction?
Just that I've been homeschooling since 1989 and I'm not done. And when I'm 62, I might be
Well, and you know what? We're never
done.
we're never done learning or teaching. I heard it said somewhere that we all need a Timothy, and we all need to be a Paul, and we all need to be a Timothy, which means we all need to be a teacher, and we all need to be a student. So, so we're never stop learning, and we never stop instructing, because quite frankly, my students instruct me, my children instruct me.
Yes, they build character.
Exactly, because we all need to keep that humble heart. So I'm going to attempt again to share my screen for our PowerPoint. Give me just one moment to figure this out. Please have just a little patience.
Well, just, as a review while you're doing that, just, remind everyone to go back and watch last week's if you didn't get it, because we really talked about defining education, defining training, defining teaching, what the biblical mandate was, what your responsibility is to Scripture, and the pivotal foundation in Deuteronomy chapter 6. So, make sure that you go back and you consider what your convictions are, what your preferences are now, and they may change. Well, they definitely will change probably with time. And, understand from a biblical concept that you have a duty and a responsibility to educate your child. Now, you can delegate portions of that out, but it doesn't matter what you do or don't do as far as part of participating in that teaching. Your responsibility is always there.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I'm going to attempt to share the screen, and please let me know if the PowerPoint is showing up.
I see it. So state requirements. There you go. Now it's
excellent.
Gotcha.
All right. So we'll begin our We'll begin our presentation. And I'm just going to go through the screens, and Nitsa, please, as I go through each screen, I'll be passing it back to you. But if at any time something comes to mind that you want to share, please just jump in. Okay. All right. So we'll go through a little bit of history first for homeschooling. We have the right to homeschool. And so just to give a little bit of history, before the latter half of the 19th century, around 1875, education was primarily a matter of parental discretion. So parents decided what their children needed to learn to become competent adults. By the 1920s, there was a shift from the family to the state as the dominant authority on education of children. And so it became normal. It became the normal status quo that no one really commented on or questioned. And so this shift to a universal free education became compulsory by various statutes for attendance and truancy regulations, so that when there were the states, the different districts began making attendance to free education compulsory, and there were consequences if students weren't attending. And so this just became the norm. And so by 1925, there were 3 major court cases limiting the power of government to control education. One of these court cases was Piercy versus the Society Sisters. Are you familiar with this case, Nitsa, at all?
This is all vague memory for me.
Okay, gotcha. So basically,
but I do recall it.
Oh, okay. And we're just going to present one of the cases here tonight. But there were 3 landmark cases that helped change the compulsory attendance. And so in the Piercy versus Society Sisters, there was a fundamental theory of liberty upon which all governments in this union repose, excludes any general power of the state to standardize its children by forcing them to accept instruction from public teachers only. The child is not the mere creature of the state, but those who nurture him and direct his destiny have the right, coupled with the high duty, to recognize and prepare him for additional obligations. And I really liked how this was stated, because this very thing is under attack today. And so there is a push there is a political push that the children are properties of the state. And there is language actually in some of the states that actually say this, that the children belong to the state. And so, so it is really important and incumbent upon us to be aware of these landmark cases that say the exact opposite, that the child is not the mere creature of the state, but to those who nurture him and direct their destiny. So I just really like how that's stated, because we need to understand that yes, scripture talks about that, but in the country where we live, there are these landmark cases that also reinforce this biblical right. And so is there anything you want to talk about, any other landmark cases or rulings in general before we move on?
Well, there's a lot of things that tie into that, and I don't know if, I can't remember if it's here, but, homeschool legal defense for the last 30 years or so, a lot of this has to be tied into the United Nations and the rights to the child, or the rights of the child, that has been battling, and they've been battling for many, many years. So it's not just so much the state and our government, but it's actually part of the New World Order issue in the United Nations. So it's all tied into that also.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up that point, because there is a push from a global perspective downward, but there's also a push from very liberal or progressive. There is this progressive ideology throughout various states, so there's this push from the ground upward, but also from a big global perspective downward. So I am glad that you brought that up.
And it's unbiblical, really, but because their whole thrust is to give the rights to the child. In other words, if you're a foolish child, throughout scripture, you learn by wisdom, but it means they have the right to be transgender. They have the right to choose whatever they want. And so that right is being taken away from the parents. And this is what causes a lot of our problems. In a modern day situation, is like in some states, I don't know if it's all states, but I know in some states, if your child runs away at the age of 12 or 13, I have seen police officers tell a parent right in front of the children that there's nothing your parents can do. It's not against the law to run away and live on the streets. And
that is so frightening.
Yeah. And so parents don't even have that backup, to do something, but yet they keep the parents responsible for anything the child does, but yet they have no right to control the child. The other thing about the rights to the custody of the child is if you've got a divorce, if you go back, and I'm just throwing the tip of the iceberg out to you, if you notice in the last 20-something years, parents who were they call them custodial parents, it's not even the right word, but the thing is you don't even get custody of the child. The wording is such that the child becomes the resident of one of the parents, and or they share it. That's because that word residence versus custody is totally different, and the state, whether you realize it or not, has the right and custody to that child. So if you try to keep your child away from the other parent, even for good reasons, the state will come in and say, oh, you're trying to keep the child away from the other parent, even though the other parent's doing something immoral, illegal. They will punish the other parent for trying to do what is right. And it has to do in that wording. So if you really don't think that you have the rights or legalities to your child, you really don't. And we won't go into this, but there's the whole thing about getting the marriage license, and the state's giving you permission, and the children that you have comes out of that. That belongs to the state. And So this affects so many realms of life. And I just want to give you the heads up. We're going to be talking about the differences in some of these words and how they also relate to homeschooling. So.
Absolutely. I'm so glad that you brought that up. And it is appalling that we would be held legally accountable, that the laws and regulations are changing in such a way that we would continue to be legally responsible for their actions and behaviors, but are not given the authority. The authority is what's being stripped away. And that is something that we need to be aware of, but also, and to be engaged with. And so there's what I get concerned about, and something that the Father has been convicting me of, is I've noticed that in this Torah movement, as we are becoming more aware of the Father's ways, and we are shifting our lives, our behaviors, our choices, how we live our lives towards the Father's ways, that we become removed, that we get rid of things, we purge things, which is great, of things that we need to get rid of, but we also become removed and no longer engaged with the community, the society that we live within, and even remove from ourselves from any type of engagement. And I think that is dangerous, but we also, for the reason that there's a biblical precedence, when Paul was brought by the religious leaders before the state, as they were trying to persecute him, and they were trying to bring legal charges against him, he appealed to his Roman citizenship. So we have to understand at this point in time, we are dual citizens in my perspective. We are a citizen of the kingdom of the Messiah, but we're also citizens where we live, and we have rights and responsibilities here as well. And so something that I've really learned over the past year and a half is continuing to educate myself and be aware of the laws and regulations that I live within, but also to let my voice be heard as it relates to issues that I care deeply about. And so that's just something that I think we need to strike a balance, and not to be completely withdrawn from the city, the state that we live in, or the communities that we live in. So do you have any thoughts on that?
Yes. I agree. But you really have to figure out your situation where you're at. Some states and some counties are much more dangerous than others, as far as your parental rights. And then, of course, what all comes into play with that is, whether you home birth or whether you breastfeed, whether you vaccinate. I mean, all of this comes into play. And so on one hand, you don't want to go out there blasting it that, hey, I got this right, and this is the only way and right way. And of course, now with drones and cameras and cyberspace and everything else, it just takes the attention of one person, much less your family or friends who disagree. But yes, you have to learn to have that balance. We are first citizens of the kingdom of Yahweh, but he also picks and puts us wherever he puts us in diaspora over the world. And we have to remember that a lot of these problems that we have to balance that with what is our duty, what is our responsibility, but also this is part of our punishment. It's like, he sent Israel out to the corner, and so we have to have the right frame of mind. We have to have the balance of the spirit and trying to be a good citizen wherever we placed. But whenever those things conflict against his word and his ways, and then we have to be forced to make decisions. An example that just was a personal example that I saw once, and again, I think the principles still have to do with home education, is if you understand the divine rights of the king, which is 1 Samuel chapter 8, one of the ways, and if you've ever really watched Robin Hood, This is what it's about. And we see this everywhere. The state, the king, whoever thinks they own the land, they own the water, but then they turn around and tell you that it's your water, it's your land, but it's your duty to report your neighbors that are misusing it. And so it's kind of a brainwashing system. And we had a situation one time where someone in our community had harvested, or basically shot a deer, and they didn't break a law immorally. I mean, God never said you can't go out and hunt a deer and put food on your table. However, the law of the land, because it has to do, again, with the divine rights of kings, what happens when we start choosing kings instead of God's kingdom, it's also part of our duty to respect that law, because that's part of our punishment. If I sent my kid to a room for doing something bad, they couldn't just come out whenever they wanted to. They had to finish their discipline. And so this concept, affects all areas of our life. And so we have to have wisdom and discernment and try to work and get along and be good citizens wherever we're placed. But we also need to balance that with, what does God require of us? And are we compromising? Are we standing up when we need to stand up? Or are we laying down? And honestly, a lot of problems we have in this country is because so many of my parents and grandparents did lay down and didn't stand up at the time they should have. And so here we are, and our children having to deal with things that we never ever dreamed of dealing with.
I think that is such a good word of wisdom, and it is wisdom, discernment, and balance. So absolutely. So we're presenting this information to you all for your discernment, for you all to then take this and do your research and seek the Father and his wisdom in moving forward. So absolutely. And so with that, as we are, the reason we're doing this is to raise awareness. And so there's a legal language. We know that in Torah, the Father uses legal language. He uses, we have commandments, and we have statutes, and we have right rulings, and we have precepts. And so the state laws, they have language. Wherever we live, there's a legal language. And so each individual state and school district regulates specific educational laws. States generally require students to attend public schools between the ages of 7 and 16. Now, those ages are different depending on where you live. So again, look at where you live for those specific requirements. State education statutes can also regulate things like details of public school operations, the number of days of instruction, the qualifications of teachers, courses of study. Certain states require specific courses before they can achieve a high school diploma. And there's also different criteria for pre-college readiness. So what a state may require for a homeschool or for a high school diploma, there may be a different set of requirements for any particular college, state college, or a specific college. They may have specific course requirements. So if your student is wanting to go on to higher education, it's important to also look into, to do research into that as well.
But can we
Sure,
go back?
Go ahead. Yes.
But on the flip side, a lot of states don't require or they don't tell you what you have to teach. I mean, some tell you that you have to teach basically what's equivalent to the system that they have, but many of them, I believe, Oregon and Montana and even Florida, they don't tell you that you have to teach a certain way. Where they will get you is when you want to go, maybe dual enroll in a college or something like that. But a lot of that, or have accreditation, but a lot of that is even not really true in my experience, having run a private school for home educators, because if the child can pass the entrance exams at the schools, they can bypass them. So
Yeah.
it really depends. And it will behoove anyone out there listening that you go find, and I know it seems tedious and hard, but you go find the state statutes for your state for education and read it all, because you need to know. I have myself been personally dragged into the courtroom, and I knew more because I made it my business to know more than the big high dollar attorney who was hired to take me down. And Father was with me. I knew the law. I knew it well enough to know that he didn't know it, and he didn't know the loopholes. And I didn't do anything illegal, but they thought I did. And they made cases. But if you know the law and you know what to say and you can point those statutes out to them, then you have something usually to stand on. And so
I'm
that's
glad you said that, because I think we do need to empower ourselves. I mean, if we can read, we can, just because we're not lawyers doesn't mean that we can't read laws.
right.
It doesn't make us an attorney. I mean, but we can read about these things. I think that especially in this society, in this culture, we categorize, and yes, there are specialties, people that spend their time getting educated in certain areas, doctors, lawyers, teachers. But just because I don't have a teaching degree doesn't mean that I cannot teach my children. I can't then go out and impersonate and get a job where an accredited teacher, a certified teacher, is required. But I think that sometimes we hand over the responsibility.
Right. And knowledge is power.
Others.
Knowledge is power. And this is really also very important in the area of vaccination.
Yes.
Because when you're dealing with 99% of social services or school officials, people that work at the schools, and the average person you talk to, they do not know the laws, the codes, or the statutes. They're only going by what they were told was the law. And I'm pretty sure there's a book called, I believe it's in this book. It was called The Right Choice, Homeschooling the Right Choice. And it was written by Christopher Kluka or Chris Kluka. And I don't know if you have that to show.
Yeah, it should be on the screen. Is it on the screen?
I don't see it now. It's not.
Oh, okay. I'll show it later.
But you can Google that. And I think it went to a 3rd edition. But the reason that I think the book was so important was it explained the difference between codes, statutes, and law. And knowing those things will empower you to learn to tell people what they want to hear, what they think they're asking, and versus the knowledge that it will empower you. And for those of you who do not know who Chris Kluka was, and actually the foreword of the book was written by a gentleman who was also a great man of God called Dr. James Kennedy. And he ran Coral Gables Ministry, Reformed Presbyterian, I believe, down in Coral Gables, Florida. And Chris Kluka, just for those of you who do not know, because I've come from that time period, Chris Kluka everybody who's homeschooling today should know who Chris Kluka is. Chris Kluka was one of the original attorneys at Homeschool Legal Defense. He fought and saved so many people's lives and families, all the while, and I might mess this up, he had either muscular sclerosis or muscular dystrophy. This man was amazing. And so anything that you can read by Chris Kluka, he was an amazing man of God. And most of your rights and what you have today are partially due to him. He's an amazing man. And so I would encourage you to read that book just from that point of view so you can learn the difference. Because a lot of times people will tell you that the rules are law when in fact they're really not. Anyway, I don't know if you want to talk about homeschool legal defense now, or we can get into that. But you need to know these differences. And there's differences in whether your state requires you to, a lot of times when I misuse the word, did you register with the county? That's not a good word. And it's a legal terminology. You don't want to have to register with the county. And any state who's trying to change the law so that you're having to register instead of notify, those are legal terms. Homeschooling is a legal term. An example is in Florida. If you're in Florida, and I don't think it's changed since I've been there, there were 3 ways to, in our minds, homeschool, but the real word legally, I think, or at least in function, is home education. Because legally, according to the state laws, there's only one way to homeschool, and that's by notifying the county and going by those county rules, state county rules. But the reality is that over half of the home educators in the state were in private schools. And to back up, before they made homeschool laws, because understand, back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, there weren't laws that gave you permission. It was understood. You had a divine right and you had a constitutional right. But that didn't change the authorities from arresting parents and putting them in jail and calling their children truant. And so because of the fear and the issues and the problems, many people, and of course, they were raised in public education, with the King James Bible, where all of the references to the divine rights of kings versus the rights of God and when to stand up and protest and when not was removed. And so what happened was there were, like in Florida, there were 2 camps. There was the camp that said, we don't want a homeschool law, because if we ask for a homeschool law and we're granted a homeschool law, we're giving the state authority over us, and only God has that authority. It would be like my son going next door and asking the father next door if he had permission to do something that he already has permission or responsibility to do at my house. And so I hope you can kind of understand that concept. So what happened in Florida, and if you're in Florida and you don't know this, when I came into homeschooling, I was told there was only one way to homeschool, and that was to notify the county. Actually, I was probably told register, which I didn't know at the time was a legal word. But I had somehow come across people who were enrolled in private schools that weren't necessarily, because there's no distinction in the Florida law between a brick and mortar school versus you are enrolled in a private school and you're at a satellite classroom, which happens to be your home. Now, when there used to be a lot of persecution before the laws were made, a lot of Christian families would hook on to their local Christian church school. So they would have like day school attendees, but they would be enrolled and then they would be at a satellite program at home. And so that always existed. And when the law came into being, then there was contention between these 2 types of homeschoolers. Those who had fought to get the law called those who wouldn't come under the law of the state rebels. And those, of course, who didn't want to felt that it was totally wrong to acknowledge that law. So what would happen is, depending on what county or region you were in, when you came to homeschool, you would only get the advice or information to whatever that was. And predominantly, it was the county homeschoolers that were notified with the county. They didn't either know or they didn't tell you had another option. But in reality, over half of the homeschoolers or home educators in the state were actually hidden up underneath private homeschools. Private schools have to report only, unless they've changed the laws, they only have to report how many first graders they have, how many second graders they have, etc. They don't report the name of the student. If you're notified, if you're notified under the county, they have every name. Now, also through that, a lot of private school administrators will do this. They give out your name and address to those powers to be, whether they're schools, recruiting agencies, etc. So it was also a private coverage of your privacy, basically. But it was a loophole. And so a person who was educated at home and a home classroom satellite, they could come up, they would get a diploma, and when they presented it to someone, no one knew whether or not they were home educated or not. And so they didn't have as many problems. But at the same time, they could apply for scholarships as homeschoolers, etc., and or go into the military, as long as they didn't recognize or understand that. But legally, they were totally okay. And then we had another faction called what we called the constitutional homeschooler, or the divine rights homeschooler, who said, no, I don't need to be in a private school, and I don't have to be under the county. And so there was contention. And what really upset me about the whole thing was our state support group hid nationally and statewide the other options to all the families in Florida. They didn't let them know the benefits or the differences, and they wouldn't educate them. And then they were growing so much and so fast, they started operating programs that were very similar, but they were telling you had to follow the state rules, when in fact you didn't, because a private school in Florida, at least at that time, had the right to determine what were graduation requirements. So all that to say, if you're in a state, call around to all the different kinds of support groups, whether they're state support groups, because a lot of them are politically lobbied to one side or the other. Contact the local area, county leaders, and find out what the practices are, because it's not always just what's listed on HSLDA, but find out as much as you can. Don't just think that whatever you've been presented is the only way and the only answer. So you need to be aware of that.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for going over that, because I think all of that is so important. I'm going to get back to the PowerPoint, and forgive me for earlier for our viewers for switching back and forth to the screen. I was trying to pull up that book. And so would you please say the author and the name of that book again, please?
It's Christopher or Chris Kluka, and that's Klicka, Kluka, like Flicka, but Kluka. And it was called Homeschooling: The Right Choice. And it was just an incredible book to learn and get that presentation about the differences in law. And the reason I bring this up is not just to, rattle you, but to let you know and understand that there are all these differences. There are all these concepts of what is right before God and a family, and is going to continue to come up as we enter in. I mean, people all over, including me, have been drugged through the ringer several times. Some of us never have problems. We go through 20, 30 years of homeschooling, no problem. But there are those of us who we stand out like a sore thumb and we get attacked. And so you need to know where you're going to stand, and you need to know what those rules are. Because as we go, if they make Sabbath illegal, if they make vaccination mandatory, if they make it illegal to have home births. I mean, they're even attacking nursing now, to breastfeed your children. And actually, we were dragged through social services for breastfeeding in our family. So these are all issues. The more, the world's going to keep changing things. If you circumcise, okay, you can be brought through the ringer, and the world touts it as good or bad, the opposite of what Elohim says is what we're supposed to be doing. That's why it's so important for you to understand these things and raise up and learn how to be good soldiers.
Absolutely. And I'll just be upfront. Homeschooling is overwhelming, especially if you're considering it, if you're just starting. Just know, yes, it is overwhelming, and that's okay. But don't let it stop you from follow. If the Father is putting that on your heart for your family to make that choice, just get educated. And a wonderful way to get started. We have been mentioning several times in the last show and this show the HSLDA, which is the Homeschool Legal Defense Association. And I did attempt to try and get a representative from the HSLDA to come on, and no, they weren't able to coordinate their schedules to be able to come on. We may be able to schedule something in the future. I'm hopeful to be able to. I've connected with their media department, and they are just a wonderful organization. So just to give you a little bit more information on who they are, since 1983, HSLDA's primary goal has remained the same: to bring together a large number of homeschooling families so that each can have a low-cost method of obtaining quality legal defense. HSLDA gives families the freedom to homeschool without facing legal threats alone. So they are an amazing resource. Their website, which I will attempt to go to later, but if I'm not able to, please, their website is absolutely amazing with state-by-state information. Like Nitsa said, it's not comprehensive, so it's not a one-stop shop, but it is one of many resources that we should go to educate ourselves. It's really economical. And Kentucky, where we live, is a very homeschool-friendly state, is what they refer. We're all homeschools are private, or categorized as private schools, and we have it's just very homeschool friendly. Not to say that there isn't any issues that come up. There are, but HSLDA has been an amazing resource, and as in our state organization, which is CHEC, Christian Home Educators of Kentucky, one of the leaders of CHEC said one time, he said, just because Kentucky is a homeschool friendly state doesn't preclude us from being paid members of HSLDA. The way he looks at it, he says it is an offering. It's part of his offering, because they use all of their membership funds to provide resources for those states that are not very homeschool friendly. So they may have a lot of cases in Pennsylvania or California where the dues from everybody around the state help to provide that. So that's how he presented it. And I thought, that's a good way to look at it. If I never use HSLDA, I know that my membership would go towards helping another family that lives in another state gain those legal resources.
They're
and
global now.
Exactly. International. Exactly. So it's just consider that. It was somebody presented that to me, so I wanted to throw that out for your consideration.
Okay.
And then here's just a list of their membership fees. HSLDA, their mission statement is to preserve and advance the fundamental God-given constitutional right of parents and others who are legally responsible for children to direct their education. And in so doing, HSLDA relies on two fundamental freedoms: parental rights and religious freedoms. And those freedoms, quite frankly, are under attack in this nation. I mean, you have to have your head buried in the sand if you don't see that, though, that the parental rights, the parental freedoms and religious freedoms, our parental rights and religious freedoms are under attack in this nation today, more so than ever. And so they advocate for those freedoms in the courtroom, before government officials, and in the public arena. And so I wanted to put that forth. Here's just a list of the HSLDA created a map showing the states which require the most regulation. And so if you go to their website, they have them in different colors. And so they list the states that require no notice to school districts, states that require low regulations, states that require moderate regulation, and states that require high regulation. And so you can go there and look at your state, and they do provide an overview of the regulations. But again, that doesn't preclude you from going to also your state organizations, your state legislators, and your local districts in gaining information on what the requirements are. Here in Kentucky, our state organization has a standard of practice to follow, and it is wonderful information. It's easy read, and it just helps us it gives us a platform here in Kentucky on how to know where to go, where to start. And so I really like that. So again, go to your state for to understand what the regulations are. And if there is a standard of practice, again, we are so fortunate to live where we live in the time that we live, because we are benefiting from the fight, the fights that have been waged before we came along, from people like Mr. Kluka and others across the nation. We're benefiting from the battles that they have waged. Now, that does not give us, that does not mean we can sit on our laurels. We have to now take the baton and continue the fight to maintain the rights that we have, but also help forge the way for those who will come behind us. So we've thrown out a couple of terms. Am I homeschooling under the quote homeschool law or the quote private school law? And so again, like we mentioned before, terms have legal meanings. And so homeschooling is legal in all 50 states, but because the federal government has no direct authority to regulate education, each state is free to implement its own legal structure for home education. So some states have specific homeschool statutes that distinguish homeschools from public or private schools by defining them homeschool or homeschool education or another similar term. Other states do not have a quote homeschool statute, but rather allow parents to teach their children at home under a quote private school law. So in some cases, a parent may operate that his or her own private school in their own home. And please forgive me for not including the term his or her. There was somebody in the YouTube chat I saw that said, please give a shout out to the homeschool dads out there. And there are many out there, and we appreciate you all. So, so I just wanted to throw that out there. Thank you for all homeschool fathers and mothers. So,
Amen.
In other states, an administrator operates the school with which parents register their children, and Nitsa talked a little bit about that. Do you want to go give a little more information as it relates to these specific terms, private school?
I was going to say that, you know, those words can mean different things in different states. Like
Absolutely.
If you say private school in one state, it would mean something totally different, like say in the state of Florida. And even within the state of Florida, I ran a 617 school, which was a non-for-profit private school for home educators. We could have had a brick and mortar building, you know, that's the same law, but you could have been, I think it was there's a 617, there's a 617, there's a 613, one's for profit, one's not for profit. I think there was one other one. So you really have to study and know what they are in your state. And it's usually a state law, but find out what it is, because like I said, each county can differ because it's based on what they either know or what they're trying to not let you know, simply because they disagree. And my point of view is, it didn't matter if I agreed with constitutional divine right homeschooling or private homeschooling or county homeschooling. I thought that everyone should have the right to know the differences and make that decision. And so that's what I did for 20 years, is made sure that people knew those choices. I don't know where we're going on, but one thing I want to say about the homeschool legal defense is this. The reality is that a lot of the problems we have, at least from my experience and with those that we had in our homeschool county, and we actually covered, because of our school status, we could cover them anywhere in the state, in any county, is that when you get attacked, it wasn't, I would say 80% of the time, had nothing to do with education. They either attacked you because you didn't vaccinate. They attacked you if you had a special needs child. I knew a lady one time whose child was autistic. She did a golf tournament fundraiser every year because she didn't want to take the state and county funds of assistance because she didn't believe that was right. And also, whenever you do that, whenever the state or county pays for something, they also have the right to something. So she didn't want to do that. Well, that made them very angry because then they lose funding. And they attacked her and took our autistic child, and the child only ate like 1 or 2 items. So it was a very devastating situation. I've known families who walked out the back door and never came back to the state. So, I've seen a lot of bad stuff. And so what I want to tell you, so it might have attacked you that. To me personally, if I had a special needs child, I would never go without homeschool legal defense. They will attack you because of vaccinations. They will attack you because of breastfeeding. They may attack you because they don't think your house is up to par. And here's the deal. Someone can call social services and make a complaint, even if it's a lie. And you are in the position that now you have to spend all your life sources to defend and prove that you're innocent. That's how most of the attacks were that we saw. Homeschool legal defense in those days, I don't know if they've changed, but they didn't help us because it didn't actually have to do with education. So the easiest way for people to attack us was because of that. However, I will say this. We were members of HSLDA when social services were called by a relative who were Christians. The bottom line was this. The relative had just had a baby. My daughter had just had a baby. And we were getting ready to move. They both had a baby within a couple of weeks of each other. The one relative did not, after 24 hours, she gave up nursing. So she was jealous and angry that my daughter took to it like a piece of cake. And in our family, we don't feed our babies bottles. We only nurse until they can sit up and grab for food, etc. Well, that relative called social services and said that our child, my grandchild, was abused and that he wasn't being fed. And he was a fussy baby. If you didn't hold him, he cried. He was just one of those babies. We had a wonderful physician, but she was in China. So they called social services. They came to pick up the child. They picked up the children with no questions asked. They take them. I actually was driving home from a medical appointment, and the ambulance was in front of me going to my house to pick up my grandchild. I immediately, when I realized, I got out of the car just enough to walk in between the EMT and my daughter, who they'd already beaten down because she'd already stood up to them and didn't let him in the door. But I had Chris Kluka on the phone from HSLDA, and because he was an attorney and I handed my phone, they did not expect to have to deal with an attorney. They decided not to take the child. They left and went and got a warrant by lying about the health of the child. Meanwhile, we go to another doctor because our doctor's out of town to prove, and get an emergency assessment of the child. The doctor, of course, said the child was perfectly healthy, but the doctor was scared of social services and would not stand up to them. So we had to have a showdown at an emergency room in a hospital. Fortunately, someone that we knew that worked for social services came in and vouched for us. We had to face the lion. They thought we would have ran, but I knew that no matter where we ran, even though they were attacking us, we couldn't outrun them. So what I'm trying to say, and this wasn't the first time, a lot of divorced parents have problems with raising their children in a godly way when one parent runs off and does something they're not supposed to. So my bottom line here is that usually a way you're going to get attacked doesn't necessarily have to do whether or not your child passed a test or did the right educational curriculum. They'll come at you from some other angle because it doesn't cost them nothing but a filing fee or a phone call, and you have to defend yourself. So on one hand, HSLDA is not going to just protect you from that, but they may be able to assist and come in some ways that they're willing or can in their jurisdiction. So that's why I behoove you that you've got to be in right relationship with the Father. You got to know his voice. You got to be walking right, because 90% of your demons and problems in this world disappear when you're walking righteously, because he will cover you and protect you. And if you're still exposed to problems, then it's a trial, and you'll learn from it no matter how bad it is, and he will sustain you. I have gone to the courtroom not knowing whether I was going to walk out with my own children because of false lies and accusations. And to be honest with you, what scared me more than anything was, will Yeshua be enough if my children are taken from me? Fortunately for me, I didn't find out, but I know a lot of families who have. So I just want to say, I totally encourage HSLDA, but you've got to know, if you're being called to this, it's not just about now. Don't be overwhelmed, but be brave enough to be a willing vessel that he will use you, he will strengthen you, he will teach you. Because if you can learn it on this side of the Exodus is going to be a whole lot more easier for you.
Amen. Absolutely. The Father is the one that we can totally rely on. He will never leave us. He will never forsake us. We will be tested. HSLDA is a great resource, but we cannot fully rely on any man or any human being. They can't be, okay, that's where my security is. I'm a member of HSLDA and nothing's going to happen. I'm glad that you brought that up. Yes, they are a wonderful organization, but our strength comes from the Father alone. Absolutely. Thank you so much for clarifying that, and also giving just your experience, because it's a faith builder. That's what we help to build each other's faith. And so I really appreciate that. Let's see. Okay. Some more information and all of this is on the HSLDA website.
Great website.
Yes, it is, under homeschool law versus private school law. In most cases, homeschool students can and should identify themselves as homeschooled regardless of the legal structure of their homeschool. However, like Nitsa was talking about, there may be some context in which it's better to use one term over another. One such situation arises if your student is going to apply for the FAFSA, the Federal Student Aid, the free application for Federal Student Aid. In this case, it's best to choose the homeschooled option. So that was just an example of using that. Again, you can contact HSLDA for more information on the differences between the private school law or the homeschool law. And again, we've talked about contacting not only the HSLDA, but also the state, becoming really familiar with your state, and as well as your county and local districts, school districts. So again, know your rights and responsibilities. I referenced this earlier. Paul knew his rights in Acts 22:25, but as they were stretching him out with thongs to be flogged, Shaul said to the captain, "Is it legal?" He asked the question, "Is it legal for you to whip a man who is a Roman citizen and hasn't even had a trial?" So, I mean, he appealed for his Roman citizenship rights, and he knew them. He knew what his rights were. So again, it's essential for everyone to do their own due diligence and educate ourselves on the laws and regulations in our states. Some states operate under the private school law and have a standard of practice, which gives guides on how to operate. Again, Kentucky is one of those states, and I'm really grateful for Czech. And on this, I just wanted to say that you had mentioned something earlier that I wanted to hit on. Right now, homeschool educators are under attack in the sense that because of all the recent school shootings this past school year, there is a mass exodus out of the public school system. And that impacts their bottom dollar. They get money for every single butt that is in the seats. And so, so there is an attack on homeschool education.
And remember, a lot of that is because of the mammon, the money that's being lost.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Oh, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. I'm interrupting you.
Oh, no.
That's one of the main reasons. Of course, besides the enemy knowing that you're now going to be infiltrating your child with the word of God.
Exactly. Like, oh no, you cannot have a foothold into this child. They're supposed to be mine. And so, they're with all the school shootings, I know here in Kentucky, but also across the nation, people are going, wait a minute. It's not worth the risk. And so they're pulling students out. And I tried to look up that number. I know here in Kentucky, there was a drastic increase because there was a school shooting in Marshall County here in Kentucky this past school year. And so, but across the nation there are. And so, again, that affects their bottom dollar. They're getting less money. And so here in Kentucky, there was a lot of regulation and legislation proposed, which would infringe on our religious freedoms and our parental rights. And so the organization here, CHECK, they really went into overdrive, and they have a good relationship with the legislators here in our state. So they've built this relationship with the legislators. And that's something that I wanted to point out. It's important for us to build relationships as we're gaining information and knowledge about homeschooling and laws and regulations in our state. It's an opportunity to build relationships. And so because they have forged ahead and built relationships, they were able to go to legislators whom they knew and worked with personally and have a discussion about why it is not beneficial to have increased regulation. They were able to educate new legislators and say, you don't need this regulation. We already have a standard of practice in place that addresses your concern. And so starting that dialogue, and even there were some home educators who were going, who were agreeing that there needed to be increased regulations, because when we come out of this system, the educational system where there's lots of regulations, we think, oh, we don't know where to start. So it would be good if we had regulations and things like that, not realizing the impact of allowing the state across our threshold. And so our state organization has been in overdrive, just educating not only legislators, but also homeschool families in the reasons why we need to protect our parental rights and our religious freedoms. And so let me make sure there's not anything. Yes, okay, I didn't want to skip over anything. So I know that we've talked about a lot and it is overwhelming, and that's okay, but realize that we are not alone. And so at this point in time, I just wanted to throw out some scripture to kind of encourage us as a body. Ecclesiastes 4 says that two are better than one, in that their cooperative efforts yield this advantage. If one of them falls, the other will help his partner up. Woe to him who is alone when he falls and has no one to help him up. We are not alone. There are numerous organizations. The social media is such a double-edged sword. It can be overwhelmingly negative, but it can also be overwhelmingly positive. We can connect with people that we are not geographically close to where we can partner with other believers. On the Now You See TV website, there's a fellowship finder. People can help find fellowship. Well, also on Facebook, there are numerous homeschool groups where people can get connected. And so I would encourage, if you are considering this, or if you are currently homeschooling, get connected, start investigating. Not to say, I would caution people, use discernment when looking at groups and assessing groups. Definitely use discernment, but also first and foremost, give it to the Father. Pray about it. Ask Him to bring you alongside others who are walking this road along with you, and partner up, because there, as Ecclesiastes says, cooperative effort yields advantage. Hebrews talks about letting us keep paying attention to one another in order to spur each other on to love and good deeds, and not neglecting our own congregational meetings. Couple of other scripture for us to encourage us in Romans chapters 12, which is just one of my most favorite chapters in all of the Brit Hadashah. For just as there are many parts that compose one body, but the parts don't all have the same function. So there are many of us, and in union with the Messiah, we comprise one body, with each of us belonging to the others. We all have gifts that differ, which are all meant to be used according to the grace that has been given to each of us. And so when we are all fixing our eyes on the Creator, and we are all pursuing Him through the Messiah, He gives each one of us gifts and talents, special skills, Scripture says. And so when we function by keeping our eyes on Him, and we have a heart and a humbleness, we can work together and benefit each other. The ear has hearing, but it cannot see. The eye has sight, but it cannot hear. And so when the eye and ear work together, there is a greater perception, a greater ability to perceive the world, and also perceive the blessings, but also adversaries. And so it's important to partner together and work together like the body is meant to. And so Proverbs chapter 17, a friend shows his friendship at all times, and it is for adversity that such a brother is born. And so I just want to encourage all of us, me included, that we are not alone. Do you have any thoughts or any other scriptures that come to your mind, Nitsa? Oh, are you on mute?
Most people who come into the Torah and the feast find themselves in the same boat as the situation when they feel all alone. And we are stronger when we come together. And that's one of the reasons why we need to find common ground, even when we disagree. Not to say we're to compromise certain things, but on the flip side, it is better to be alone if you cannot find the right fellowship.
Absolutely.
The same for anything. So you may have to go through that wilderness time. The good to that is that you'll be learning directly from the Father and the Holy Spirit. But hopefully when you learn to listen to His voice and He goes, okay, I got you down. I know you're going to pay attention to my voice, and you might not as easily be misled. Then, sometimes then He'll bring the groups and the people to fellowship with. So yes, I do. I mean, there's nothing greater than having a cooperative fellowship, whether it's in, fellowship within Him or homeschooling. But also realize that if you're in homeschool co-ops or homeschool groups or state, local, county, you may still stand out on a sore thumb. Today we have actually a lot of not just Christian homeschool groups. Back in my day, when I first came in, it was only the crazy convicted Christian who was homeschooling. There were very, very few, and I've never met them, but there were a few that were secular. And then within like 10 years, it grew so big that it became secular, that we had Catholic homeschool groups. We had Wicca homeschool groups. We had, some of those other funky religious groups. So, and there were secular. So it's just important to try to find that group. But if you are now crossing over to Torah, and I know this is what happened for me. It's after about 15 years, the more we crossed over, the more now we weren't really welcome because we didn't go to the cookie exchange. We didn't go to the Christmas thing. We offered to, teach them about Hanukkah or Passover or Sukkot. And maybe once or twice they allowed us, but we didn't have a problem. If they wanted to continue doing what they did, we understood. We didn't have a problem with it, but they had a problem with us. So, but now you guys, are growing so much more that you're going to be able to have other groups that at least, maybe observe the Sabbath and the feast. And right now we have cyberspace. So, but I just wanted to warn you, sometimes you need to be alone to protect you and your family. And Father knows your needs. He knows that you need fellowship. He knows you need help and support. And just pray, ask him, but make sure you don't settle for any fellowship that would actually destroy you versus waiting during that wilderness time until he gives you that fellowship and cooperative support that you need.
I'm so glad that you said that. There are worse things than being alone. And that was exactly our experience. We came into this understanding of Torah, and we finished out that school year and then withdrew our children, felt the call to homeschool, and we were absolutely alone for the first 2 years of my children's homeschooling. And at the ages that they were, teenage, it was difficult. It was very difficult for all of us. But I look back at that time, and I'm so very grateful that the Father kept us alone in the wilderness with him, because he taught us to see him and to recognize him and to have discernment. And it was the most precious time that we bonded with him and each other. And we gave our fellowship up to him, and our homeschool fellowship as well as our congregational fellowship up to him. And he is faithful, and he does bring that. So just if you find yourself, like Nitsa said, in the wilderness, press into the Father. Be patient with that process, because I promise you, you will be blessed. You will be blessed. He is enough. He is absolutely enough. And he will bring in his time the fellowship. But more than that, he will bring the discernment that you will then gain, that will enable you to witness to those, to separate from those that need to be separated from, to witness to those that need to be witnessed to. It's just such an amazing experience. I have so many stories that I would just love to share about how he gave discernment about when to separate, but also I found just one short story about discernment. I was so blessed by this. My daughter joined one of the groups in our homeschool, and it was our first year. And so we went to a meeting, and it was, in the winter, and I didn't know what the agenda was. And it turned out to be a Christmas organization. And I was debating. I had just prayed that morning. I felt such a pressing on my heart for the Father to use me. I'm this homeschool mom, and I used to work out home, and I felt like I wasn't being used by the Father. So I was just pouring my heart out to him that morning. Please, use me, in a special way. And so we went to this meeting, and I was tired by that evening. I was so tired. I didn't sleep well the night before. And so I was kind of looking for excuses not to stay. And when I saw what was going on, I was like, oh, wow, okay, I don't know if we should stay or not. And so I felt the Spirit, the Father, just, you need to stay. And he pointed out this mom to me, and I did not know her. And I just felt his pressing, because I had that time of building that relationship with him. I knew it was him, and he wanted me to go over and pray for this woman. And I did not know her. And, I started hawing with him in my mind, and you know that. And he reminded me of my prayer that morning. He literally played the recorder of my prayer to him that morning. And so I said, yes, Daddy. Okay. Yes. And so I went over to her and just, clumsily introduced myself to her. And, I know you don't know me, and introduced myself, but, can I pray for you, and just started a conversation. And it was just such a beautiful intersection where the Father had prepared me. The Father had brought me to her. She was in real need, and just ministered to her. I just had the honor and the privilege of surrendering to the Father and allowing him to move through me. And this past Passover was their first Passover. And so, they're honoring the Sabbath, and they're learning about the feasts. And so please, if you're in that wilderness time, trust me, the Father will bless you so much in that time, and he will prepare you. And it is a season. He will bring the fellowship. Just absolutely leave it up to him. And it's just, and this friendship, this fellowship that we now have with this wonderful family is growing. And it's just so amazing to partner with the Father. It absolutely is. So I hope that encourages somebody out there.
Well, one way to think of it is, learning to hear his voice, to follow him, and then coming out and being with others who know how to follow him is much better than coming out and being with a bunch of others that are running in different directions or trying to bulldoze you over.
Absolutely.
So there is a balance, and you have to kind of see the whole picture and just really rely on him. Because, we can give you all kinds of advice, but your situation is unique, and only the Father knows what you need and what you don't need. And, we're just trying to show you some of the pitfalls or some things that might help along the way. But again, just like the last show, it really boils down to just knowing him and learning his voice and following him, and him doing and completing the work in you to bring you to a place that you and your family are learning to walk with him.
Absolutely. And we're just introducing terminology and hopefully some resources that may bless you or benefit you where you're at. And so some of those organizations, some of those resources, Nitsa mentioned that book and by Chris Kluka, and I'm definitely going to be getting that book.
And get with your local support groups or state groups if you can and don't have any issues with them, because they do offer a lot of support. My warning there, though, is sometimes they hold hands too close to the agencies, and you may be putting a noose around your neck.
Yeah. So again, discernment and prayer, and discernment. And something that, we do, that I have gotten into the habit of doing, is just praying all the time. First thing in the morning before we go out. What's that? Without ceasing, right? Without ceasing, exactly. Mm-hmm. When we meet new people, before we go to any event, when I go shopping, before I bring anything into my home, it's just prayer without ceasing. And so we've mentioned HSLDA, we've mentioned connecting online, just Google, always use discernment. Also your local library, they may have, game nights or lots of resources, and a lot of homeschools meet at the library. So you can always check those. Some of the libraries where we were in Florida,
for each county would have a whole section within their library of information for homeschoolers. They would keep the local information, and so when someone came in, and then they would contact us because they actually got it from the library. So if you have a county that will do that, or library, that's pretty awesome.
Excellent, excellent. Something that I have learned, just a little thing that I want to talk about again with discernment, and I've mentioned it before, is just from my own experience, engaging in the political process. So one of the very first homeschool things that I did with my children was a Christian Day at the Capitol here in Kentucky.
Oh, cool.
And I learned so much in that one day, where I didn't know a lot of these things. And I learned what terms were. I was introduced to the legislators and was so blessed by the person that was giving our tour. Our tour was a former chaplain of the Capitol, the former Capitol chaplain. And he and his family were actually the family in our state who forged the trail and changed the laws. Like, they literally had a shotgun at their front door ready because they had the law coming to their house, wanting challenging them about homeschooling their children. So they were literally the landmark case here that changed the law from being illegal to homeschool to then having the legal right to homeschool here in Kentucky. And so it was such an amazing experience.
The point I would point out to that was what you're talking about is it is those who went to battle that stood up.
Yes.
That have made and paved the way. They may have suffered, but they stood up and paved the way. And that is where we've been brainwashed to not stand up because we don't want to make that payment. And we're in a situation now where most of us don't. I mean, sometimes we don't stand up because we don't want to make those waves. We don't want to suffer the consequences. But the reality is, if we don't, then we don't pave the way for our freedom or other people's freedoms. And, the time is coming where it's going to be much, much worse. And so it is important. And that's a very important point that you made, that these people have all stood up and made a difference because of what was right.
Fight. Exactly. Yeah. There is a time to fight. Yeah. And quite frankly, I mean, you mentioned it before, but we have a battle coming. And so we need to have discernment on when there is a time for peace and there is a time for war. There are things worth fighting for. And so it was such an honor. I learned so many things that day. I got to know the homeschool friendly legislators, and I have signed up for several action agencies to where I'll get a text alert if there is a legislation that about a concern that I'm interested in, homeschooling, pro-life issues, and things like that, so that I can then go straight to that bill and then read about it and contact my legislator right then and there. And so we were fortunate enough to have the current Capitol chaplain come and do the graduation address at my son's graduation this year. And so it was, I just would encourage to use discernment always, but to engage in the process, be aware of the legislation that affects us.
We had in Montana about 10 years ago, maybe a little longer, they were trying to change the law. There was this particular guy there trying to change it, and he basically wanted to change it from notifying the county to registering, which means a whole different thing, and tracking and getting in your business and having jurisdiction. And now Montana is a big state, okay? And we were in Northwest on the Canadian-Idaho border, and it actually takes about 15 hours to get to the southwest border. I can go to Washington, Idaho, and to the beach in 8, okay? And so when they did a law like that, and the Montana state legislature was totally filled. Now, Montana only has about 400,000, 500,000 people. But that house of government was filled because homeschoolers from all over the state, whether they had to drive 10, 12, 15 hours, filled up every space in that building. And everyone was ashamed to vote with this guy. Okay. So that's kind of just our presence. Not many were allowed to talk. It was just the presence because everyone knew they were going to be watched, weaseling out and signing and going along with this guy. And as a result of this, we got to meet a gentleman that I had actually met in real estate school. And my daughter met the right people and got to come back and was recommended to be there for a week and be a page. So that was an educational experience for her. So, those are things to learn that you can be involved in.
Exactly. It's important to, and we can't be aware, we can't sit there and keep our focus on all the legislation that they're working on and be able to understand it. But there are there are political action organizations.
Which is why you want to sign up with HSLDA in your local and state groups so you'll get those notifications.
Exactly. Because they'll let you know. And then you go to, all you got to do is Google the bill number, the wording comes up, you read it, and then you decide how you want to vote on that. It is so, so important to be associated, so that you stay informed on those decisions.
And you may do something crazy and call 4 or 5 people or just one other person and say, okay, honey, watch the kids. We're going to the state house today. You know what I mean? It's just, you do what you got to do to keep that right. Because as a home educator, compared to most people who send their kids off to school, they don't understand the freedom and the rights that they have, right? I mean, even right now, like in California, right, they passed this new law that they have to teach this curriculum for, was it LGTB or so, whatever that is. And you can't even opt out of it, right?
Exactly.
Are public school parents trained to think and do they treasure it so much that they're all going to stop what they're doing and going to rush down to make sure they don't change these laws? No. And so they went ahead and passed these laws. But home educators now, that's a whole nother story.
Right. And we have the time to, that's an educational event. Let's go.
Yeah. And everything you're doing in life, whether you're working, whatever you're doing, when your children are part of real life, they're getting a whole different education that's much more practical and applicable to what they're going to be doing, rather than being in a classroom with a bunch of peers of the same age who really, are just at the beck and whim of whatever they're taught to respond to. So,
right. It's such an artificial environment.
Right.
So it is such a blessing. So we are a peculiar people. We are a remnant. We stand out, like you mentioned. We stand out sometimes like a sore thumb, and we are few in number. But think back to when the children of Israel were in the wilderness, and they were with the Father, walking with the Father, the mighty, mighty things that He was able to do through them. So know ahead of time that homeschool community is diverse in beliefs and practices. I'm very fortunate here where we live. We're members to 2 different groups, and it's very eclectic. It is very eclectic, but both groups embrace the diversity where we live.
That's awesome.
It is. I'm just so, so blessed. And so just remember that in doctrine, unity, in opinion, liberty, and in all things, love. And always, always, always use the biblical standard for fellowship. Be discerning about who you allow over your threshold and whose threshold you walk over. So just really be discerning about that. Take every single thing to the Father. And so just a little bit, we're nearing the end towards the PowerPoint presentation. Developing your standard of practice based on the biblical mandate, based on incorporating state and local regulations, but also what we talked about in the last episode is the homeschool mission. What is the mission statement and the vision statement that the Father is giving you in your home educational system? So any thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I saw a couple of posts, and because I think, isn't next week curriculum?
I believe so. Yeah, there was a question that I was going to bring up here shortly to you that had a little bit to do about curriculum.
Right.
So.
But this kind of segues into that. So back to your mission, it's not just about your conviction and your preference of what your mission is for your family or what you believe God wants for you. Also, if you can, go particular to each child.
Yes.
And even at a very young age, 1, 2, 3, 4 years old, Father will start revealing things to you about that child. Like my oldest child, I knew when she was 2, oh my gosh, she's going to be a great nurse. She's going to be a great nurturer. That's just what she's made. She has the gift of service and love and caring for others. And so, if you focus in, and have these little lists of, okay, Father, what is the gifts that you're giving each of this child, so that as I pick my curriculum or our field trips or our events and opportunities, keep it open with the mind of, will this serve part of the education and training for this particular child? And keep that in mind, because that's important. Like for instance, and one of the ways that you can do this is, if your child's musical or they do have the heart of service, you can pick and go to elderly people's homes and go in and make gifts or do acts and skits and plays or play music. That's just an idea. If someone's really interested in trains, and you go visit the Savannah train station or something, but keep it, not just overall, but also just ask the Father, what is it about this child throughout the years, and review it every year. What is developing, what is budding up in this child, or what is an area that we as a family or individuals need to be disciplined in, basically. So, and then pick your curriculum, like I said, in your events or training opportunities, because things will happen in the community, that you go, oh, this will, because when you home educate, everything is educational.
Everything.
Everything's educational, whether it's good or bad.
Absolutely. And just to piggyback on that, it is such a more organic, functional thing. Like I said, it's such an artificial setting, a classroom setting versus the home and the community. And so some things that we have learned about our neighbors on either side. We have elderly neighbors, and so going out and meeting them and seeing what their needs are, and learning about different organizations like Meals on Wheels or Meals from the Heart, food pantries, St. Vincent de Paul, where they're always looking for volunteers and help. So, you can sign up to deliver meals to the elderly once or twice a week if that fits within, if you see that your child has that, spirit of service and that type of thing, and incorporating community service into whatever, if it's the Humane Society, if you see that your child has a passion for animals, so any Humane Society anywhere is always looking for volunteers. And so, looking at community service actions. We've been to a local food bank where we just, sort food into bags that they then deliver. So just looking, is your child somebody who is very structured and organized and likes, an assembly line type of thing where they can provide that service and learn and grow and provide that community service. So there are so many different organizations out there who are desperately looking for volunteers, and it's a perfect opportunity for us to go and minister and witness to the community in those ways. So, and just directly in the neighborhood, where if we're busy working outside the home and our kids are busy going to school and all their activities, we get so disconnected in this culture and this society from the people living right next door to us. Whereas in the last over 2 years that I've been home, I know who my neighbors are now. And you know what I mean? I meet with them and talk with them, and it's just a wonderful opportunity.
Can we back up for a second here?
Sure.
I was just thinking of something that we kind of didn't touch on, but maybe we should. I don't know why something you said made me think about it, but one of the problems, and this kind of has to do with the legalities, is number one, and I mentioned this before, I personally think it's discerning to try to keep your children inside during the public school hours. Be careful and aware that when you go out or you're shopping or whatever you're doing, because sometimes kids have been picked up as truant. So when in fact they're not, which can open a bunch of can of worms. But one of the issues I used to have, especially, was when I went to the post office or to the grocery store, and they would go, why aren't you in school? Or, what are you doing in school? And of course we get, are you having a nice Christmas, vacation? And, you really need to pray. And I think the personality of each family is different. But my attitude was, I instructed my children, you don't answer the door. You don't answer the phone.
Absolutely.
Because of who and what we are, until they're old enough to understand. And when my children were old enough, like my daughter, when we had the issues, she knew not to do that. And Homeschool Legal Defense has great information about that, on what to do when social services shows up, because that's really going to be a testing time for fear. So I always instructed my children to say, because a lot of times I'm standing right there, they'll just say, you can ask my mother about that, or my parents. Do it nicely with a smile, not, whatever. Of course, my boys are pretty shy. They used to just turn their head and walk away. But my girls were pretty good about that. So that's another thing that you might have to, address. But on one hand, try to avoid that issue, But sometimes I'd go to the post office at 4:30 and they'd still look at my kids and go, why aren't you in school? And a lot of times you don't need to explain the real answer, because they were really interested in the real answer. They're interested in what they think the real answer should be. So you really need to pray and discern at the time when you answer a question to someone, like sometimes it was none of their business that, we were on a night shift at the time, or I know families that travel with the husband, the great opportunity. There's nothing like traveling to learn. But those are things you're going to have to deal with. So you're going to have to figure out, what's the right answer? What's the right way to address that with respect? And a lot of these people really are not nice, and we have a society now where people will just come up and invade your children's space. They really have no right. They should be addressing you. One time I had it was either a Jehovah Witness, I think it was a Jehovah Witness, come to my door, and my child, I had a child who answered the door that wasn't supposed to. And I was just right behind, at the door, and the elderly lady, she had a very young girl with her, but she was starting in on my child with the pretense of, do you love Jesus or whatever, which, Jehovah Witnesses don't look at the deity of Yeshua, wherever you set on that. But here's my point. And I told the lady when I got there was, you have no right to address my child. Okay. This is a jurisdiction you don't have. So you need to address me. Don't come to my door knocking when you see my child. I'm not even talking about the deception of it, but it's just a right that you don't have, and she looked at me, and because she was an older woman, I think she totally got it. And she apologized. And then we had a great conversation. But, people really don't have those rights. And we've been trained in our society not to respect the sacredness of consciousness. So those are things, again, that you just really need to address. And if anyone has any great advice about that, that's great. I'm just not one of those who has a lot of grace in those areas. So. You
Yeah,
probably
I'm
have a
so
lot of grace, Patricia. I can see it all over you.
well, I do appreciate that point that you brought up because when we started homeschooling, especially when we moved and I started staying home, and we would go shopping during the day to beat the crowd kind of thing. And I just was shocked how many times, especially when we would go, apparently when older people go, and we were asked a lot, like, there no school today? What are you doing here? Just very
Right.
frank and abrupt. And so I would always answer, yes, we homeschool, and I'm teaching about shopping and meal preparation and home budgeting, and that kind of thing. And several times, the father had to teach me, okay, you're giving, not that I'm giving too much information, but I'm stop talking.
Well, yeah, and sometimes that's a great answer to give someone, because they're like, wow, I never thought about it that way. And other times it's like, they might be a social worker or a school teacher or something, and they're like, they're just scowling at you to begin with, so you got to really be careful,
because there is a negative connotation with homeschooling. And I'll go into this just for a little bit, because what hits the news are bad stories, are bad examples. So just a little something that I became aware of when there is a lot of negative connotation, and where it comes from is the stories that people hear about. They don't hear about all the good stories and the successful homeschooling families. That's a very rare that comes out. What they hear about are the problems. So what happens in the schools, at least here in Kentucky, and I know that there are issues across other states, but when they don't like their numbers to go down. So say somebody is having behavior issues and in school, or academic issues, and they're failing out, and they go from school to school to school, and they're not successful, but they can't let their numbers look bad. And so they move them on to another school. Well, finally, they move them out of school and they're homeschooled.
Yeah.
And so they're the ones that they just fall through the cracks because nobody wants their numbers to look bad. And then so they hear about these students that are just left and without any instruction.
And they never had the heart of homeschooling to begin with.
Exactly. And so, but they fall through the schools push them along as well. And so that happens. So we went to our state fair with one of the clubs that my daughter was in, and we were competing, and it was really interesting because I was so proud of our homeschoolers. Everybody in the club happened to be homeschoolers, and they were courteous and nice and friendly, and would go up to other children and put their hand out to shake their hand and introduce themselves. And whether our kids did well or not, they would shake. If they didn't do well, they would reach out their hand to congratulate the winner of that specific round. And they really stood out in that way. And their creativity stood out as well. And so one of the ladies came up and said, "Where are you all from? And well, what school do you go to?" And the leader, who's another homeschool mom, said, "Well, we homeschool." And this lady was a public school educator, retired over 30 years. And she had a very negative connotation about homeschooling because of her experience. The only experience that she had with quote unquote homeschooling were failures, so to speak, and the bad things that have happened. And so it was a real opportunity to to demonstrate and then be able to witness about homeschooling to her. So it was over an hour conversation that the homeschool mom had with her, and just really was able to open her eyes. But had she not witnessed the behavior and the interactions and the creativity of our homeschool students, and then learn they happen to be homeschoolers, it was just such an interesting opportunity to be able
And
to be
that's
a
very
part of
true.
that.
I've had public school teacher friends who, they would sit and complain about these homeschool kids they would get. And I would just look at them and like, you're getting the ones we wouldn't call homeschoolers. You're not seeing all the ones that are doing great jobs, and you won't, because they're not going to come into your halls. You're not going to interact with them, right? I took a class one time with this doctor who worked in the ER, and she was talking about, she had this really bad thing about vaccinations and the people who showed up, who didn't have vaccinations. Well, it was kind of the same thing. She realized that she was getting, that group of people who really, they weren't living right. And so they judge the homeschoolers by that. They judge the people that are natural health or anti-vaccination by the same thing, because they've never been exposed to the cream of the crop and the great numbers of us that are out here.
The
So
great numbers.
yes,
There
they
is
are
a great number. Yes.
There's great numbers. Lego robotics was another area where you would see that, in competition. I went to one in Louisville, Kentucky, several years ago. So yeah, they stand out, they really do. And so, it's just that
Absolutely.
opportunity,
Exactly. And just to throw out, it just popped in my head, another great organization, wherever you are, I think it's in all the states, is the 4-H organization.
Mm-hmm.
They have amazing clubs and opportunities for
Usually
socialization.
there are homeschool clubs too. If you look and ask your support groups, they actually have 4-H clubs that are just for homeschoolers.
Yeah, my children went to a Constitution class through the 4-H homeschool group. It was all homeschoolers, and it was open to public school. It just happened to be all homeschool groups, or all homeschool students for that. So there's just a myriad of opportunities out there. The 4-H organization is an excellent. We have a great extension office in our county. So there's just a lot of opportunities. I know we have thrown a lot of information out there.
We have a question in the room.
Yes, I was going to ask you that. So Christine asks, we know that a lot of history books, as well as other things taught in school, are incorrect. How do homeschoolers address that when they are tested by the government in order to pass their aptitude test? And I know we're going to be addressing curriculum and things like that next week, but do you mind going ahead and just having this discussion tonight?
No, absolutely, because I have a similar question. And, I think within different, hey, they're just going to have to watch all the shows to get all the answers to the same part of the question. No, I'll let you go first.
Okay. Well, here's some thoughts that I have along those lines. So where we are in terms of aptitude tests and things like that, because my children were older when we started homeschooling, they had some aptitude tests in the public school test. Mm-hmm. Now there are some homeschool groups that offer locally here, where they take tests like the Iowa test to be able to test their kids out and find out where they rank on certain skill levels and things like that. There are access to tests if your kids are older at local community colleges, where they will, instead of taking the ACT, you can take these tests for free, just to kind of see skill-wise where your kids are at. So I'm addressing the part of the question that's just related to testing, to kind of see where your kids fall in skills. Now, where information differs in history books versus the truth that we know, mm-hmm. in our household, we teach both, because I want my kids to be able to reason out. And so they have to know what they're going to be hit with, because it's like, take the issue of evolution. Mm-hmm. When I was in school, it was taught as fact. And so we present that information, and we present the information about creation. And then we look at the evidence. Now, here's what this theory states, and here's what this theory states. Now let's look at the evidence and reason together which one makes more sense. And so where there's information that's incorrect, I would challenge that. And then like, especially like with all the false illustrations about the false drawings about embryological development, doing the research to find out when they discovered that was wrong, that was false. And the Piltdown Man and Lucy, all of these flagrantly false, quote unquote, evidence for evolution. And so showing that look, this was presented as science, as fact, that this was the evidence for evolution, and it turned out that it was false. And so it's an incredible learning opportunity for our kids to then learn to test everything. Don't just accept that something is fact because somebody said so. So I know that's a lengthy discussion about when history, but it's an opportunity to study and to discover, is this actually true? Is this actually history? Because history is there. People are trying to rewrite history now with things like the Holocaust. So what are your thoughts?
Well, I think a lot of it depends on your personality and your conviction. I totally, on one hand, agree with you. Yeah, it is a lot about teaching, and it depends on, again, the age of your children, where they came from, their background, at what point, that has a lot to do with it. I always struggle between trying to do what I know they expected to just detesting the whole thing because it was a robbing of my time and my energy, and realizing, having been that bridge between the private school and the home educator, and the one that I felt like, because my mindset was always, if I was in ancient Israel, how would this be? And it becomes very complicated today. And the first thing I would say, from my perspective and personality is, and I struggled with it through the years, is number one, this kind of goes along with another question I had from a lady. We'll go into more when we get to curriculum, but if you teach your children the truth, this is what my experience says. It doesn't matter if they get the parts wrong in the science and history section of the aptitude test, okay? That are lies, because they're going to outshine when it comes down to real hard facts of writing and mathematics and reasoning and logic. So I don't think on one hand it's going to make a huge difference. I think that because even Christian books are like really wrong if you want to pick at them, and I won't pick on the big textbook Christian writers, but they're used by a lot of homeschoolers, and there's a lot of wrong, especially when you get in the area of history. Because unless you're going to primary and secondary documents, you're not going to get the real truth. Most of history has been rewritten in this country since before the Civil War. But that would be my first thing. To me, I struggled and went back and forth, straddling the line between what does the system want versus what I feel like I should be set free from. And eventually I was able to be set free. But I also, during the years that I know I was being watched, okay, for instance, and let me explain. The reason I was being watched was because my two older daughters were from a previous marriage. And they always wanted to attack us, but they never attacked us on home education because they knew better. They attacked us in other ways. Whereas with like my two sons now, we don't have any of those issues. So we've been totally free to homeschool without that burden. So you really have to look at your family dynamics, your situation with your work, your parents, your community, how you're going to address that. But I really believe that if you teach them the truth and you teach them to live right, they're going to excel. But if you feel that you need to straddle that line and be a bridge between the two, then yes, teach them, both. I do think they should be aware of both. I mean, that's definitely, but at the same time, that could be totally burdensome to have to be teaching two different things all the time. I think that a general Christian history book overall is a good overview that everyone should go to. Whether or not the details are true, and there's some really blatant things that are a problem, that's what the general consensus is out there. And I think that a good overview of that. And then if you have the time and the energy, and or you have a child that's really into it, then go deep into those subjects. Look at the primary, secondary documents. I saw a comment. One of the questions was, how or where am I going to find a curriculum in history that's not going to teach that America's great? May I address this on the flip side? Because I spent a long time doing providential history and writing curriculum guides for homeschool magazines and writing curriculum for co-ops, I have a different perspective. I know that the United States, is based on part of a New World Order issue. But I don't focus on it from that point of view because I read the primary and secondary documents. I read the words of the people who suffered, who believed they were called, like Abraham, to go to a land to promote the gospel. I read what they went through. And so the way I look at it overall in history, especially American history, although every country has this history, but particular we do, Father used America as a predominant area to send the lost tribes of Israel. Okay? The pilgrims were the lost tribes of Israel. They were looking for a place to worship and be separated, not to conform and change and legislate everything like the Puritans. There was a difference between their thought processes. And we have that same problem today with a lot of the Christian patriot movement. Some of them you would agree with a lot, but those same thought processes would make laws that will make you an enemy. So my point in all that is Father has his story in every nation around the world. So look at America as a great place where Father dispersed his people and in other countries and hid his seed for a reason. So we actually do really have a very godly inheritance in this country and in many other countries, and a truly Christian believing, even a Hebrew mindset. The pilgrims knew the feast. They didn't celebrate Christmas. They knew their Hebrew roots. The first, I know this is a big controversial thing, but if you study this out, you will see that the first harvest, Thanksgiving, was 8 days. It was a Sukkot for them. So I'm just saying, let's look at the big picture. Let's just not get on the bandwagon of, everything's evil and it's a New World Order and the White House and all this is all set up. Yeah, the enemy's always busy setting up his kingdom in every land in all the world. But Father has a remnant in every place in this world that he's doing something, and there is a Christian, and I don't want to use that word right, but there is a believing remnant thought and process that he has been doing throughout history. And now we're just seeing it starting to connect and come all together. So I say teach general overall Christian history and history, but realize there's going to be a lot of mistakes. There's going to be a lot of wrong things. And we don't have the time to study every primary and secondary document and every subject. One of the things I love to do with young children and older children, and even for adults, is do an overview, but pick some subjects that interest you. Christopher Columbus was a Jew. A lot of people don't know that. Read his writings. Read 5 or 6 different autobiographies or biographies on him, okay? Because if you focus on a certain individual or a certain time period in history, you're going to read, even in Christian books, things that conflict so that both things can't be true. But you're going to see what is called the noble thread of truth. And you'll start to see, and you'll just start praying and asking, Father, what is going on here? And hopefully in the future, I will come back and teach on the life of Pocahontas and Captain John Smith, which has been totally misaligned throughout history, even by Christian writers, because nobody read the documents. But it's an idea and a way of teaching your children. I would rather my children know really good in depth about, say, George Washington, or really Patrick Henry's better, but Patrick Henry, and know the in-depthness about them with an overview. Does that make sense? And see the progression of the seed of the gospel that, really did start in the Middle East and has gone around the world and is now coming back to full. So there's so much more to it than just saying, America's great. America's great because God and God's people were here. That's why. And that's why any nation's great, because he's got a purpose. We've got to remember he took us and put us in diaspora, and there's a purpose and a reason, and there's something good in every nation because he's there. He's got a remnant in every nation. Sorry.
Absolutely. No, I so appreciate that. That is absolutely right. That to learn the history that the Pilgrims and certain Native American tribes were part of the lost tribes. That's right. So tying it back to scripture, I love that. And so that is an excellent place to stop this show for this episode. Nitsa, I'm so grateful that we get to do this together. Thank you so much. Fun. It is a lot of fun. And so would you mind just leading us out in prayer for homeschoolers and this remnant?
Thank you. Dear Heavenly Father, we just come before you and we just thank you. We thank you for the privilege and the freedom that we have. And Father, teach us not to misuse it, not to take it for granted, because we know it's for a season that you're letting this light go out. And Father, for every person listening, every person that you're drawing to homeschool, it's not just about homeschooling. It's about bringing their house and their home in order and their family to love you and serve you and prepare a generation after generation to be prepared and ready to return when the Mashiach returns. Please let each person know and feel your presence. Let them know that, yes, it can be overwhelming, but it's you that completes it. It's you that does it. And cause each of us, Father, to totally depend on you, even for those of us who think we have all the strength and the wisdom and the might. Let us realize it's truly of you. And for those who are very faint of heart, Father, strengthen them and let them know who you are. And it is you that will carry them through, open the doors and shut the doors that they don't need to be in. We just thank you and we just praise you for the opportunity and all those involved. And I just want to thank you and praise you, Father. It's a great privilege to be able to still not be totally hiding with your arrows that you've given each of us, Father. We just ask that you would cause and raise up our children to be mightier in spirit than we are and know where you want their arrows to land. Amen.
Amen. Thank you so much. And thank each and every one of you viewers. You all are why we do what we do. And so we thank you, and be looking out for our next episode next Wednesday, where we will be going more in depth with homeschool, talking about curriculum. But until then, we wish you blessings and shalom.
Shalom.